Hello everybody and welcome back to our studies of the English legal system. In this final chapter, we're going to be talking about the concept of access to justice. And we're going to talk about the ways in which justice is operationalized, at least when we talk about the ways in which ordinary individuals interact with the English legal system. We'll talk about the modes and methods for legal advice in this lesson, and also talk about the role of legal professionals, the distinction between, for example, the solicitor and the barrister within the English legal system, as an example that we're going to explore. So, the idea of access to justice generally refers to two different things, or at least to two things concurrently. It refers to essentially having two component parts attached to it. There is the first, which is relating to the funding when it comes to cases in both the civil and the criminal jurisdiction. This is one area where we see a limitation relating to the access to justice. It is difficult for an individual to be able to achieve justice in civil and criminal cases, specifically in civil cases, if they don't have the funding to bring about litigation, and so therefore they have to accept whatever charges may be levied against them, or potentially anything that any kind of unjust settlement and outcome that may have taken place. Then there is the second element which relates to access to justice, which talks about there being a potentially lack of resources vis-a-vis legal advice. So not only are we talking about a lack of funding in terms of the ability for people to actually bring cases where they believe they have been unjustly treated, but also they have a lack of resources when it comes to being able to obtain information about what their rights are in a particular legal situation. We'll explore both of these problems in turn. Ultimately, evidence of either of these problems could lead us to a situation where one has been put in a position where they have a lack of access to justice. So let's begin first with this concept of legal advice. And legal advice really is fundamental on the basis that law, in and of itself, is a particularly complicated area. People who are lawyers spend a lot of time practicing, and they spend a lot of time studying to become lawyers. It is a highly and deeply academic subject. And this channel specifically is aimed at providing educational resources for undergraduate and postgraduate students. That is really where we essentially have our beginnings and endings in terms of our mandate or our essential goals for this channel. We are providing educational resources that sort of sit at the undergraduate and postgraduate law level. But because this is open to everybody, because it's free educational resources, it also attracts attention from what I've described here as ordinary citizens. And by that I mean non-law students, people who don't study law, maybe someone who has a passing interest in law. When it comes to giving and being provided with specific and technical legal advice on situations that that the individuals may find themselves in, this could be difficult to acquire. You don't find that at this channel, for example. We don't provide legal advice to anybody. None of these lessons are providing legal advice. We make it very, very clear in the description of every single lesson and on the channel description page that this is not a legal advice channel, this is a legal education channel. They're two different things. So it is most often the case that the person who is involved in a particular legal dispute may not have the adequate foreknowledge of the law to handle themselves effectively. And it is even argued by many individuals that even if you do have a background in the law, for example, you should always seek outside advice to dealing with legal problems. And because of the fact that when you have representation, you are able to, first of all, delegate tasks to those individuals, but also allow them to deal with situations that may arise. So, given the fact that most people don't have access to knowledge of the law, and most people haven't spent their 3 years doing an undergraduate LLB, and then maybe a few years doing the SQE, and then maybe even longer than that doing a training contract and all this kind of thing. Most people aren't put in those positions, and so as a result of which don't understand the law in a way that they would have to in order to essentially navigate themselves through a particular legal dispute. And so when these legal issues arise. They often involve things like housing problems. Maybe you are being evicted by your landlord and you don't understand your rights, or domestic abuse or discrimination / human rights violations. So you may have been discriminated in a workplace environment and you don't understand the process by which you can make an appeal or you can make a complaint. Legal advice services are required in all of these situations. This doesn't necessarily mean that the law the legal advice implies that you're going to have representation or someone is going to bring litigation on your behalf. It might just be the case that you have been in a situation where your rights have been violated in some kind of way. You don't know it, and you didn't know it, and you can get legal advice to essentially be able to understand your rights better in order to be able to navigate yourself through potentially complicated and difficult legal situations. So how do you get legal advice? Well, for a number of different places, you can just ring up, or you can email, or you can go into particular places. So, for example, when we talk about civil legal advice, the CLA, it is a government-funded and government-run scheme which aims to provide civil legal advice to those who have no knowledge or understanding of the legal issues they may find themselves in a particular dispute. They often provide a phone service advice. This is in relation to things like housing, debt, and specific issues relating to family law, so things like child custody or marriage and divorce, or even things like domestic violence, all of which can be potentially very, very useful for those who are seeking this kind of advice. In addition to this, you may find yourself having to go to the Citizens Advice Bureau. The Citizens Advice Bureau was established in 1939, and it was a method by which any individual living in the United Kingdom, can gain access to advice, and this would include not just legal advice, but also non-legal advice. It is a general Citizens Advice Bureau, but in addition to that, you can also find information which is legal in nature. Just like with the Civil Legal Advice Helpline, the Citizens Advice Bureau will often provide legal advice on issues related to things like discrimination, things like debt and financing, things like housing and homelessness, domestic violence, family issues, even some potential human rights violations which have been levied against you as a result of maybe workplace discrimination, or maybe even things like school discrimination at school and education environments, etc., etc. Another element could be through the use of trade unions. Trade unions are a useful source of legal advice on matters specific to the union interests. Okay, so trade unions don't necessarily provide you with advice on everything, but if you are looking at things like industrial matters relating to work or employment, a trade union is very useful if you will find yourself in a situation where you need some kind of legal advice. And so it is often recommended that you speak to a union representative as a way of being able to understand what your rights are and potentially going forward with any kind of litigation in the future. Where there is, say, for example, a dispute which arises between an employer and an employee, the employee will often have access to a trade union and access to legal advice and even legal services through the trade union as well.